we're just going to. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very special opportunity that we have this evening. Today on the Jewish calendar, we observed the fast day of the 10th of Tevet, which commemorates the siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in anticipation of the destruction of the first Jewish temple. But in 1950, the chief rabbinate of the newly founded state of Israel declared that the 10th of Tevet on the Jewish calendar should be designated as a Yom Kaddish Klali, a day of collective recitation of Kaddish for those who were killed in the Holocaust, for whom we did not know the day of death, their yahrzeit, or for whom there were no living family members to recite Kaddish for them. And so the day of the 10th of Tevet on our calendar has ancient commemoration, but also a more modern commemoration over the last 75 years as a day of Holocaust education and commemoration. And so it's a wonderful opportunity that our synagogue has via Zoom to hear from Dr. Harvey Moser. Welcome you virtually to the Hollywood, Florida community, Young Israel of Hollywood, Fort Lauderdale. Dr. Moser is a physician, went to NYU Medical School and was a dermatologist in private practice and on the staff of NYU Medical Center for over 50 years. You would fit in very well down here, Dr. Moser, because we have lots of physicians as part of my synagogue. So we welcome you. Dr. Moser has an incredible story to tell. Dr. Moser, as a child, was on the boat, the St. Louis, which in May of 1939 went to sail from Hamburg to Havana, Hamburg, Germany to Havana, Cuba, with 937 passengers, almost all of whom were Jewish refugees. Ultimately, Cuba's government refused to allow the ship to land. The United States and Canada were also unwilling to admit the passengers, who were finally permitted to land in Western European countries. And ultimately, 254 passengers on that St. Louis ultimately were killed in the Holocaust. Of course, Dr. Moser later made his way to the United States, subsequent to the Voyage of the Damned, as it became well known, a well-known film depiction of the episode of the St. Louis. And so, Dr. Moser, first of all, thank you, and welcome your wife Harriet as well, joining us this evening. And we very much look forward to hearing your words as we commit always, and especially today, to remember the events surrounding World War II and the Holocaust. Remember those events so that as part of our collective Jewish memory and identity. So why don't we begin, and I'll pin you so that we can all see where you are. And you're front and center. And the rest of us are around the screen listening and looking forward to your words. First, let's start from what made your family decide to leave Germany at that time?
Well, as you all know, in 1933, Hitler came on the scene. And in 1936, the SA, the brown shirts, used to march past our house. We had a big house on the main street in Haslach, in Kinzigtal. I'm sure nobody has heard of this. It was a town of 3,000 people in the Black Forest region. And they would, by 1935, they would march, the brown shirts would march every day past our house, singing exactly the same phrase, wenn das Judenblut vom Messer spritzt, dann wird alles gut sein. Translated, when Jewish blood spurts from the knife, and all will be well. And that was why we eventually moved.
And I understand that immediately prior to that move was Kristallnacht. What do you remember from that dark episode in Jewish history?
Freiburg and we can have supper.
Well, that's all right.
Yeah, you can remember.
I forget the question. Would you repeat the question?
Sure. What besides the brown shirts marching in front of your home? What else do you remember about the Nazis? Do you remember the night of broken glass, Kristallnacht?
Yes.
What part of those events do you recall? You can share with us.
As you all know, Kristallnacht, a night of broken glass, the Nazis went around to every Jewish store, to every Jewish synagogue, and broke the glass. So it's called the Night of Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht. And Harriet,
You leading out to where the school left Hassach. They bought your house. You went to Freiburg. We had a house.
oh yeah, my wife reminded me of a couple of things. My father had been in this town in Germany for 35 years. And he was in business until 1933. In 1935, the brown shirts started marching past our house. In 1936, Jews were no longer able to own a business. So we moved from this small town of 3,000 people in the Black Forest. We moved to Freiburg, 40 kilometers away, where my father had an apartment house, and we moved into that apartment house. Now, Kristallnacht was, of course, the night when the Nazis broke all the windows of Jewish establishments and set ablaze the synagogues. And I remember I asked, my mother said, "You don't have to go to school today. I said, "Why not?" Because they burned it down. Now, as it happened, immediately next to the school that I went to, which was part of the synagogue, there was a university with large pillars going up 2-3 flights. And this was the University of Freiburg. And as I learned later on, one of the people who graduated from medical school there was Joseph Mengele.
Wow.
So while I was going to the Hebrew school, he was studying medicine.
Wow. So the Kristallnacht was in November of 1938, and the St. Louis set sail from Hamburg the following spring, May of 1939.
Right.
Okay. And what do you remember about the ship, about leaving? Obviously, you had already left your home to Freiburg. What do you remember about leaving Germany and the boat ride on the?
Before I mentioned that, Kristallnacht was a time of course, when the brown shirts,
No, no, no. Your mother heard that you were taking boys and sent you across the world. And your
All right.
father was arrested and sent to Dachau.
okay, my wife just corrected me that my mother heard that they were sending boys, children to the camps. And with this in mind, she immediately had us smuggled across the border into Alsace-Lorraine. We had two cousins of my father in Alsace-Lorraine. And we went there, we were smuggled across the border at night by a woman who I think had done this kind of thing many times before. Because when we got to the border, which was right not far from our home, she winked to the cross to the guard and had a passport with the pictures of my brother and myself substituted for the two children that she had. So, but I'm sure she has done this many times before because she and the guard obviously knew each other.
Wow. Wow.
Until
And
that,
so you were with your brother at that time in France. And your parents were still in Freiburg.
My parents were still in Freiburg, and my brother and I were living in France with two families, two cousins of my father. They were very nice to us, to the parents, but unfortunately, we were not allowed to leave the house because if we had been apprehended by the police, they would have sent us back to Germany. So we were confined to the house. And my problem where I lived was that there was a 18-year-old girl who could not bring her friends to the house because if their friends started talking that there's a German refugee there, we would be sent back to Germany.
Wow.
So what I did, the girl was very unhappy about this, I will say that. And she kept complaining about the fact that I was there. So they had a dog, a German Shepherd. And what I did, instead of staying in the house where that girl was who didn't want me, I started playing with a dog and spending a lot of time in the doghouse. And rightly so, I loved that dog,
Wow.
German Shepherd.
Wow. And you were about 10 years old at that time, is that correct?
I was either 10 or 12,
No,
maybe 10.
10.
38 to 10.
Yeah, 10 years old.
10 years old. Okay, so it's like lots of boys your age, you loved playing with the dog, although the circumstances surrounding that, of course, were very, very unique. And I imagine as nice as your relatives were, it was difficult to leave home, leave your parents to cross the border into France.
Yes,
And the St. Louis left from Hamburg, is that correct?
yes,
So
but we boarded to St. Louis in Cherbourg, my
you-
brother and I. We were taken there by a cousin of mine, Jean, who took us to the boat,
Wow.
and we joined our parents on a trip on the St. Louis. The St. Louis, by the way, was a luxury liner. It was very fancy, tablecloth, music playing through the whole dinner time. And I must say at this time that the captain Schroeder, was very, very nice to us. There were people on board who were going to be spies sent to Cuba, Nazis sent to Cuba for whatever reason. But he made it clear that the captain said he does not want any problems on the ship. We were to be treated like any other passenger, and that's the way it was. So the trip was very, very nice for us on the St. Louis.
Was that your first trip on a boat? Have you been on a
Yes.
boat before?
Yes,
Imagine it was the first trip on such a fancy boat.
on a very fancy boat.
Right.
As I said, tablecloth and menus and dinner music and the whole works.
And so it was you and your brother and your parents, and you all traveled together. They got on the boat in Germany, and your relatives made sure you made it at the stop in
Cherbourg,
France.
France.
Okay, and so it was supposed to travel from there to Cuba.
Right,
And,
with over 900 Jewish passengers.
so it was mostly Jewish passengers on the boat.
Well, mostly there were, as I said,
A few, right?
a few Nazis on there,
Right.
a few probably rabble rousers, Germans who were going to make trouble in Cuba.
Uh-huh.
But the captain was totally on the side of the passengers, and he would not tolerate any problem whatsoever on the ship.
Sure. So the boat sails across the Atlantic to Cuba, and what happens upon arrival at
Upon arrival in Cuba, they said we would be delayed one day before we could get off. And then after a day, they said one more day, and then one more day. And on the third day, they announced that the visas which were issued in Germany by the Cuban consul were not valid, and we could not get off the ship.
Wow. Do you recall what the passengers or your parents were doing at that point, or what the captain was saying? What was what was the plan, if any?
The plan was that we would,
They made a committee.
a committee was formed to try to figure out what we would do. And the first thing the committee said, we are going to sail along the coast.
No. They sent to the joint committee, and you remember the whole thing? The Cuban government said $500 a person, and
Oh, that's right.
they sent a committee. The
Right.
committee contacted the joint committee in New York. They sent
Speak
Beres-
louder, speak
They
louder.
sent Berison.
Yes,
They sent Berenson to come down there and negotiate, and he went back, and then they gave him 24 hours, 48 hours.
right.
So go ahead.
And
Okay, excuse me. They formed a committee.
This was happening. This was happening outside of young Henry's sphere. This was going on behind the scenes, obviously.
But this was once after the third day,
Yeah.
they formed a committee
Okay.
on the boat that we organized, and they said, we got to figure out what we're going to do. We don't know what to do. They formed a committee. The committee decided to contact, I think it was the joint
Joint
committee,
distribution committee.
in New York.
Right.
And because they were told that they needed $500 a person to get
So the
off.
Cubans were looking for a bribe. Or
Yes,
they-
and exactly. And then eventually the committee sent someone down to Cuba. His name was Berenson, and negotiated. And then they said, okay, you have to give the bottom line was 500.
48 hours.
But you have to,
in one.
you need $500 a person here in Havana within 48 hours.
Hmm.
You want to finish up?
Oh, you can finish that.
He went back to New York, and he came back 50 hours later with the $500 per person, and went to the Cuban government with it. And they said, sorry, you're late, 2 hours late.
Wow.
Goodbye. And that's when pandemonium broke out, and all the passengers came up on the ship. You got to
On
finish
the
this.
deck.
On the deck. You got to finish this already. You know.
All
This
the
is your life.
passengers came back on, assembled on the deck, and there was really pandemonium. And all the passengers on the deck were crowded, not knowing what to do. I stood on one end of the ship, of the deck, next to a man. And the next thing that I see, he takes out a knife, cuts his wrists, and jumps overboard.
Wow. A lot of
And-
desperation. A lot of desperation.
Pardon me?
A lot of despair, not knowing what to do next.
Well, the Cuban harbor police was surrounding the boat all the time. They quickly picked him up and took him to the hospital in Havana. His wife asked permission to also go with him. They would not let her get off with him.
Wow.
By the way, years later, when I was in my office, I saw that woman, and
This is Lowe.
Mrs. Lowe, yes,
Wow.
many, many years later, and she recalled that. We told that story. Now,
Wow.
where were we carried?
Oh, so you were unable to disembark at your destination in Cuba. That was that's where you were planning on being. So what happened? What happened next? Where did the ship go? What was next for the ship?
Well, a committee was formed, and the committee decided, first of all, to go along the coast of Florida. And they sailed up and down the coast of Florida, asking Roosevelt, who was the president at that time, for permission to land. He would not give that permission. They asked Cordell Hull, who, by the way, had a Jewish wife, for permission to land. He said no, too. The only one that would have let us land was Mrs. Roosevelt, but she could not persuade her husband or Cordell Hull to let us land.
Wow.
So then the committee started telegraphing all over the world to various countries who would possibly take us. And we started, the first country that said they would take us was China, Shanghai. We went towards Shanghai, and as we were coming close to Shanghai, people said, wait a minute, Shanghai, they speak Chinese here, and it's so far from wherever. Let's not land there.
Mhm.
So the committee decided, all right. They turned around and again wired countries all over the world. And the next country that said they would take us was Dominican Republic. And we sailed to the Dominican Republic. But before we got there, landed there before, people said, you know, it's very hot down here. And they speak Spanish. Who can ever learn to speak Spanish? So again, they did not go to Dominican Republic.
Wow.
Finally, I think it was the father of Joseph Kennedy,
Was it Joseph and the father of Jack Kennedy?
father of Jack Kennedy, yes, who arranged that 4 countries in Europe would take us, each 1/4 of the boat. And they suggested that if you have relatives in any of these countries, you go to that country. We had relatives in France, so we went to France.
Hmm. So you got off in France finally, expecting to be in Cuba, but ending up traveling around for a while and making your way back to France. And then, you eventually made your way to America.
Well, it wasn't quite that fast.
Not that.
In France, my parents were treated as foreign citizens, and my father was in a home for German refugees near Lyon. My mother was in a house nearby for women. My brother and I each went to an orphanage outside of Paris, and this was the house of, who was it, Harry?
Rothschild.
Rothschild.
Rothschild homes.
They were Rothschild homes
And it
in
was
the
the
past,
Ose organization.
and the Ose organization had taken it over,
Hmm.
and we were housed there. And I remember specifically that the war started about 6 months later, and we were constantly shepherded to the wine cellar, which of course was our shelter,
Bomb
but
shelter.
was very cold. The wine cellar was like a refrigerator. And we went there practically every night while the German planes were overhead.
Wow. And at this time, you were separated from your parents. Your brother was at a different orphanage, so you were by yourself.
Yes, my brother was at one orphanage, I was at another orphanage,
Right.
and my parents were in a home for German refugees near Lyon, and my mother was in a home nearby.
That's where you
Wow.
learned to ride a bicycle.
Yeah, I learned to ride a bicycle in that home.
Is that right? Any German shepherds there? No dogs. Just a bike.
Just a bike,
Okay.
and I taught myself to ride a bicycle
Uh-huh.
down the hill.
Make use of the time. That's always.
Exactly.
And so, I guess your parents were working to find a way out of France once the war reached France, and they were able to make arrangements to travel to America at that point.
Yes. My parents had well-to-do relatives in Paris, and they somehow arranged for visas for us to come to the United States. And we went by
And they
ship,
got the affidavits also.
and the affidavits.
Right.
And we went by ship, which left in the middle of the night because the war was on. And the accommodations on that ship were not exactly like at the St. Louis, where they were like a fancy hotel.
Uh-huh.
It was a ship, a freighter, and it left in the middle of the night from a small port, Saint-Nazaire in France. And every day we had drills jumping into the ship,
The lifeboat.
into the lifeboats,
Wow.
and what to do in case there's an emergency.
So,
So we came to the States. I remember we passed the Statue of Liberty. The captain woke us all up to view this, and a ship landed on the dock, and we got off, and on the way back, this was wartime, the ship was sunk by a German submarine.
as that freighter went back to Europe, it was sunk, huh?
As that freighter went back to Europe, it was sunk by a German submarine.
Wow.
Fortunately, we had all gotten
Oh,
off the boat.
wow.
And we were welcomed by Hayas, the Hebrew Immigration Society.
Yes.
They were wonderful. They took us to the shelter on Lafayette Street, and we had a room. It was open at the top in a very large facility, which is today on Lafayette Street, was then also on Lafayette Street, 425, right near Wanamaker's,
Ooh,
which was on 8th Street.
wow. And so that's where you settled, you and your family settled in New York City?
That's where we settled in New York City, and Hayas was wonderful to us. We had wonderful food, we had shelter, we really had everything that I can think of.
Wow.
And we had a room which was open at the top. And
And and now that you're a 11, 12-year-old boy, you went back to school?
I went back to school. I learned English.
Tell about that when you went with the toothbrush and your mother.
Yes, my parents spoke English. My father had been here on business in America. My mother had been in America for 10 years. When she was 17 years old, till age 27, she came to America. So she spoke English. I did not speak any English. And I started going from door to door on Ocean Avenue and
I don't know.
Ocean Avenue and another avenue selling toothbrushes and combs.
Wow.
And I asked the people in my broken English, would you like to have a toothbrush? Would you like to have a comb? And it was 10 cents, I remember, for the tooth. A lot of people gave me a dime and didn't even take the toothbrush and comb.
Wow.
But they were very nice. And at the end of the day, I think I bought a peach cake and brought it home for all of us to eat.
Oh,
From Evangers.
From Evangers.
that's very nice. Oh, well, that's such a nice story. And you went on to high school and college. Where did you go to college?
I went on to Brooklyn Technical High School,
Mhm.
which was, of course, in Brooklyn.
Sure.
And from there, initially, my mother just become a dentist. And
All that experience with toothbrushes, that must have been.
right, got to be a dentist.
Okay.
But I took the exam to be a dentist, where you had to carve some chalk. And somehow I said to myself, if I can be a dentist, I can be a doctor too, physician.
Uh-huh.
So I switched over to applying to medical school. And the first year I applied, I did not get in. I
You applied early.
applied early. I really didn't know what to say, what to do. And on the way out of that interview, I tripped and fell on the floor. That was my exit the first year. But then on the second year, when I applied, I had a much nicer interviewer. Over the first year, I really, I said things that were not totally kosher. And the more I said, the worse it got. So I realized that was it. But the second year, I had a very nice interviewer. And whatever happened, he thought I was okay. And he got me admitted to the medical school.
Wonderful. Which medical school was that?
NYU.
NYU. Okay. Wonderful.
And I spent 4 years at NYU. And I spent 1 year at Einstein. And I spent all my other years at NYU for about 48 years.
You did your residency in dermatology.
Residency in
and skin
dermatology.
cancer.
Skin and cancer. And I stayed on the staff for all those years.
Wow. Wow. There was a question here, Dr. Moser, with the, when you were on the St. Louis and traveling around, was there enough food for the longer trip? You remember it?
There was
Remember them
plenty
running
of
out?
food. There was plenty of food.
Even for the long trip?
They stopped along the way and they loaded up.
Got it.
I guess, I don't know how they did it, but they did it. The food was excellent all throughout the trip. And the service was excellent. And the staff, the waiters were very nice as far as I can remember.
Sure.
And the captain, of course,
Right.
he was on our side.
Right.
He did not tolerate any riffraff on the ship.
Sure. Sure. Wow. So the good service and good food, but you didn't get to your destination.
Didn't get to
The
the
freighter
destination.
got you to where you needed to go.
What did you tell him? You told him that you had all that, you had that lift with all the furniture and everything in Cuba. That's when you got the piano back.
Yeah, well, the piano is not important, Harry. I'm sorry, what was your question?
No, I just noted that it was the uncomfortable freighter that got you to your destination. The more
Yes.
luxurious boat took you back to France. So a little bit of both. But
The irony of it is that the luxurious ship didn't take you where you wanted to go. You needed a freighter to get you where you wanted to go.
Right.
that's right.
And the freighter came to the United States.
That's
Yeah.
right. Your final destination, which is
My
what,
final destination.
there you
And
go.
we landed, and Hayas was wonderful to us.
That's fantastic.
The Hebrew Immigration Aid Society.
Yes, yes. So
well-
if there's any other questions, you can put it in the chat. I'm happy to ask Dr. Moser. But Dr. Moser, there are some young people on the chat on the Zoom now, and we are recording this, and we're going to share it with our teens and our young people. Is there any message that you'd want to share about your experience overall with the St. Louis? Any parting message that you'd want us to hear at this time?
Well, I would say that no matter how things go, you have to keep plugging along. You cannot, just because there's one thing that happens which pushes you down, and maybe another thing that pushes you down, you have to constantly keep persevering And eventually, with a little mazel, with a lot of mazel, I would say, and perseverance, you'll get there. There's no such thing as not being able to do something if you try hard enough. The truth is you have to try, and you have to persevere, and you have to push and push and push and push. And of course, having a wonderful wife doesn't hurt either. And having, I would say, perseverance.
What you said about America.
And of course, America is unquestionably the best place to do anything. I don't think I could have done this in any other country. I know I couldn't have. But in America, if you're willing to keep up the good work, anything is possible if you persevere and persevere and persevere. Anything. This is the best country in the world.
Wow.
By far. There's no other country that can even come close.
Wow.
Except that Israel.
Of course, Israel. Yeah.
Understood, understood, but we really appreciate your time. You know, I was thinking, as you were leaving that message, reminds me of the message that you need mazel and you need muscle, the combination,
Yes,
mazel and muscle. Does that sum it up, Dr. Moser?
I think you're absolutely right.
I think so too. I want to thank you so much. This has been really a real pleasure. I speak for all of us to spend some time to hear your story directly from you, to hear your voice, to see your face, and your lovely wife, Harriet, as well. Harriet, thank you so much for helping to facilitate, and we really appreciate your time.
A pleasure to be here and join you in this.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me, and it was a pleasure to do this.
Thank you. Thank you.